Hello and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the United States Center's online webinar series. My name is Brendan Thomas-Noone, and I'm a research fellow in the Foreign Policy and Defense program at the United States Study Center here in Sydney, Australia. I'd like to welcome you to this online session where we will be discussing our latest piece of research in our series of publications on deterrence issues, co-published with Pacific Forum in Honolulu, Managing U.S. Nuclear Risks, A Guide for Australia by Dr. Fiona Cunningham. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia. The University of Sydney stands in the lands of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on and pay respects to their elders past, present, and future. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted today to be joined by three leading thinkers on strategic and nuclear issues in the Indo-Pacific, all good friends of mine and of the United States Study Center. First, the author of the research we will be discussing today, Dr. Fiona Cunningham, a non-resident fellow with the Foreign Policy and Defense program at the United States Study Center, and assistant professor of political science and international affairs at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Fiona is also a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for the year 2020-2021. We're also very lucky here to have Dr. Euan, who's a Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Euan was previously Executive Director of La Trobe Asia at the La Trobe University in Melbourne, and he was also previously director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Program in Sydney. Euan has experience at the RIIS in Singapore and served at the UK government as a research analyst at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office as well. Lastly, we're also very lucky to have Dr. David Santoro, Vice President and Director for Nuclear Policy Programs at Pacific Forum in Honolulu. David specializes in strategic and deterrence issues, as well as non-proliferation and nuclear security. I should also mention that David has an edited volume on the US-China nuclear relationship in the context of multipolarity coming out next year, which looks really great, and I'm looking forward to reading. So the paper we are discussing today draws mostly on Fiona's deep knowledge, experience, and scholarship regarding China's nuclear posture and strategy, and is really an excellent guide to some of the most pressing issues surrounding the broader US-China nuclear relationship. Fiona centers her analysis and arguments around the risk of nuclear use between Washington and Beijing in the nuclear domain, whether inadvertent or purposeful, and how the continuing evolution of the deterrence dynamics between the two powers is increasing these risks along a number of fronts, with some of these risks larger than others. These issues will only grow in importance as well, as we are likely entering into a prolonged period of US-China competition, of which the role of nuclear deterrence and weapons will only likely grow. Fiona's paper is particularly timely as well because of how it links these broader and sometimes esoteric issues back to Australia. I think most in the academic and security community in Australia would agree that nuclear and strategic issues in particular receive scant attention here in Australia. And contrary to what some may argue, Australia does have a significant and influential role in these areas, both in the strategic sense as well as Australia's well-known history of advocacy in arms control and non-proliferation issues. So with that, I may turn over to Fiona to give us an overview of her paper before we open it up to a conversation between the panelists, and then turn to Q&A from the audience. So Fiona, if you'd like to give us an overview.
Okay, thank you very much, Brendan, for that really kind introduction. I'm really excited for this webinar. Thank you all for tuning in, whether you're in the evening as I am here in Washington, DC, or in the morning in Sydney, or anywhere in between those time zones. So I wanted to hit on a couple of the key points from the deterrence brief and then a couple of the key analytic judgments from this brief before we dive into the conversation that we're going to have over the next hour, because I'm really excited to hear what my fellow panelists have to say and to hear from the audience as well. So I will start off with sort of four key takeaways that I hope all of you will take away from this discussion. The first one of those is that things could be a lot worse in the US-China relationship than they presently are. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. While the broader US-China relationship has deteriorated, some could say, and tensions have increased quite precipitously in the past 12 months or so. This area, the US-China nuclear relationship, I would argue is an area where the United States, Australia, and China and other interested parties should all work hard to stop things from getting worse, because there is certainly room for things to get worse, and there's space to keep things as they presently are. The second key takeaway that I wanted to just note is that the risks of nuclear weapons being used in a future US-China conflict, in my judgment in this brief, are low, especially if they're used deliberately by one side to gain a coercive advantage. The risk of inadvertent use is higher, but still not as high as some have argued. And to take a quick aside, inadvertent nuclear escalation occurs when there is an intentional action by either China or the United States in pursuing their objectives in what's otherwise a conventional conflict that systematically damages some part of the other's nuclear arsenal that could lead them to misperceive their arsenal as a threat, and either threaten to use nuclear weapons or prepare to use them to some greater degree. And because the likelihood of conflict, though, is rising, I would say in general over a series of US-China flashpoints, including but not limited to Taiwan, there are now more opportunities for these risks to be realized than there were in the past. Third, I think the best military strategy for the United States and China to counter, or rather United States and Australia rather, to counter China is one that does not rely too heavily on nuclear risk. And I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but China's own military strategy, in my assessment, aims to coerce its adversaries below the nuclear threshold and doesn't necessarily anticipate that an adversary is going to be using nuclear weapons in a future contingency. So making nuclear threats against an adversary that doesn't think that these things are necessarily credible in a confrontation between two nuclear armed powers is less likely to succeed in deterring the outbreak and escalation of conventional conflict than what is a military strategy more focused on conventional means. So that means focusing on robust conventional military capabilities, having adequate nuclear capabilities to deter the unlikely event of Chinese nuclear first use, and limiting the risks of inadvertent nuclear escalation. And the fourth key takeaway, before I go into these judgments in a little bit more detail, is I argue that Australia needs to invest more in its broad-based nuclear literacy, both within and outside of government, so that we can have more informed policy making and public debate over how best to manage some of these risks. Because there are an array of options for Australia in thinking through some of these questions, and it's easier to have those kinds of discussions when there is understanding of the sort of Byzantine and intricate details of nuclear strategy, and in particular, some aspects of Chinese doctrine that can help inform those discussions. So before we dive into a little bit more of a panel discussion, I also want to provide an overview of some of those key judgments, in particular, the judgment about what's happening with the US and China's nuclear capabilities, and with regards to the risks of nuclear use. So in recent years, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about China. That is my research focus, and I think it's the area where there are more questions about what might be happening with China's nuclear capabilities at present. So I think we've seen growth in the sophistication of China's nuclear arsenal in recent years. The US Defense Intelligence Agency has projected that the size of the arsenal is going to double in the near future. And we've also seen some new capabilities come online with China, most importantly, perhaps two new road mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles, the DF-31AG and the DF-41, and the intermediate range accurate DF-26 intermediate range ballistic missile that can carry both nuclear and non-nuclear warheads, which isn't the case for the longer range systems. The land-based missile force remains the main leg of China's nuclear force, but China is also adding a bomber leg and continuing to develop the submarine-based leg of its nuclear force structure. These sea and air-based legs are less survivable at present than the land-based force, but its submarine force in particular is frequently cited by Chinese strategists for its ability to overcome missile defenses. And even with these changes, China has continued to stick by its long-standing no first use policy that it's had in place since it first tested a nuclear weapon in 1964. The current force structure is compatible with the continued goals of a retaliatory nuclear posture, which is what China has had thus far, which has the main goals of countering nuclear coercion and being able to retaliate if China suffers a nuclear attack. But it does also enable China to do some things that it hasn't been able to do previously. So because, just taking a quick tangent, any country that happens to have nuclear weapons can decide to use its nuclear weapons first, regardless of what it has said in declaratory policy beforehand, Western analysts have often looked to aspects of China's nuclear force structure and operations that help to confirm this retaliatory force posture that China has had, because it made the force poorly suited for China to make credible threats of nuclear first use. They included in particular a lack of low yield and shorter range accurate non-strategic nuclear weapons as they're known, and secondly is the separation of China's nuclear warheads and its missiles in peacetime. And so some of the developments that China has engaged in over the last decade or so undermine some of these objective signals that, Western strategists have looked to as confirmation of China's nuclear restraint. So in particular, having a ballistic missile submarine force creates questions about whether or not you can continue to separate your warheads and missiles in peacetime. Similarly, there have been reports that China is at least building the kind of early warning architecture in space and on its ground-based radars that would allow it to move to what's called a launch on warning posture, where its warheads and missiles would be mated in peacetime. In addition, the DF-26 in particular is China's first accurate theater range missile. So in light of China's current willingness to abandon certain other long-standing foreign policy principles and its more muscular behavior in the region, these developments are understandably raising concerns about what China's nuclear future might hold. It is worth pointing out, though, a couple of reasons not to assume that China is on the road to looking like the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In particular, there's no public evidence of a debate that China might follow the kind of Russian model of an escalate to de-escalate nuclear strategy, this idea that you could engage in limited use of nuclear weapons first to put pressure on an adversary in a conflict. There is also evidence that China's approach to strategic deterrence focuses more on threats of first use of non-nuclear capabilities like its counter-space weapons. And finally, China's decisions to build some of its new land-based missiles go back at least a decade, so their deployment is somewhat coincidental with the more muscular foreign policy it's currently demonstrating. Okay, so next, moving to some of the risk assessments that I make in this brief about how likely it is that in a future contingency nuclear weapons could be used, and also about arms racing. I argue in this brief that the incentives for deliberate use for both China and the United States are relatively weak for three reasons. First, the stakes in a lot of US-China contingencies are too low to justify nuclear use. Taiwan perhaps has the most potential, but the PLA, I would note, hasn't altered its military strategy from the idea of fighting a limited or a local war, which would mean that the means and costs of the conflict would also be limited in recent years. Secondly, in some research that I've done with my co-author, Taylor Fravel, that was recently published in International Security, we were able to interview some experts within China who recognized that while first use could provide a country with a military benefit, it has a huge political cost for getting acceptance of the changed outcome of, for example, a Taiwan conflict. A final reason why I'm not as concerned as some that China might use nuclear weapons in this contingency is because a lot of Chinese strategists are quite pessimistic that nuclear escalation can be limited once a nuclear weapon is used. And rather than seeing this as something they can exploit to coerce an adversary, they see it as a fetter on countries threatening their first use of nuclear weapons instead. Secondly, I'll turn to the possibility of inadvertent escalation. And as I noted in my first couple of key points, this occurs when one country's large-scale military operations touch the nuclear capabilities of another country in unintended ways that create incentives for them either to signal or alert their nuclear forces, or even potentially use them because they become concerned that they're no longer going to have those capabilities if they wait to continue to be attacked. So I think there are two instances in which this could occur in a US-China contingency. The first would involve the United States conducting deep strikes on China's mainland missile bases or infrastructure, its air defenses, its submarine communications stations that would be supporting both Chinese conventional and nuclear operations. And this, some have argued, could signal, or rather could trigger nuclear use or signaling by Beijing that the United States could mistake as preparations for China actually using nuclear weapons. That said, though, I don't think that the combined nature of Chinese, particularly command and control systems and bases, is as pernicious as some have argued. And there are some interesting trends in the way that these things are perhaps moving as China's rocket force continues its reforms and modernization. The second possibility could involve China taking actions that threatened aspects of the US's nuclear command, control, and communications infrastructure. In particular, anti-satellite attacks and cyber attacks do have an important role in China's plans for how it would execute local wars in the future against an adversary like the United States. And especially given the fact that the United States' satellite and some of these communications facilities could also have roles supporting US missile defense and conventional operations. And the United States has made some clear statements in its most recent nuclear posture review that it would consider the use of nuclear weapons if a country damaged these kinds of capabilities. Finally, I'll just touch very briefly on the risk of arms racing, because this is constantly showing up in a lot of media reports. In my judgment, there isn't currently an arms race between the United States and China, nor do I think that there is clear evidence that China wants to sprint to parity, so gain a nuclear force that's a similar size to the United States. But I do think there are two pressures on China that could lead it to build up its nuclear force. The first is the United States trying to maintain the current edge that it has in nuclear capabilities against China. And the second is that steps the United States is taking to deal with the myriad of other nuclear armed adversaries that it has to deter, in particular Russia and North Korea, could put pressure on China to build up aspects of its force structure or the numbers to deal with things like missile defense in the case of North Korea, or to deal with things like non-strategic nuclear weapons that the US has recently reinvested in to deal with some European contingencies. And China will react even if the US isn't targeting it with these kinds of capabilities. So turning briefly in my last couple of minutes to Australia's situation in all of this, I think the key interest for Australia is maintaining the credibility of its extended deterrence guarantee from the United States and the integrity of the US alliance system more broadly in the Indo-Pacific. And this overarching interest, I think, leads Australia to have sort of three sub-interests. One is avoiding nuclear threats and use. The second is ensuring adequate deterrence of Chinese conventional attacks at the conventional level. And the third is preserving the non-proliferation regime. And all of those three things, I think, sort of feed into this broader question of maintaining the alliance structure as it presently stands. It's important to note, though, that no conventional strategy Australia and the United States and other countries in the region could adopt to deter Beijing will be devoid of nuclear risk. But relying upon nuclear risk to a great degree to deter some of China's conventional adventurism, if you like, is less likely to be credible to Beijing, as I mentioned at the beginning, because of its judgments about the credibility of nuclear threats among nuclear powers. So I'll just touch on very briefly, I think, some of the things I think Australia can do going forward in the categories of arms racing, in terms of certain nuclear capabilities and the alliance more broadly. So in terms of arms racing, one of the things that we've observed recently is a change in how the United States has gone about attempting to cajole China, if you like, into engaging in nuclear discussions from one that was more coaxing and inviting during the Obama administration to one that is more perhaps coercive, one could say, in the case of the Trump administration. And I don't think that that's necessarily working, and what's more, it could end up backfiring by strengthening China's nuclear hawks, by making nuclear weapons an issue of nationalism within China, and giving China license to build up its nuclear capabilities. So in the brief, I recommend that Australia try to pave the way for alternatives to engage China, perhaps through the P5. Secondly, I'll just point out very briefly, I think Australia needs to take a position on the role of theatre nuclear weapons in how the United States should conduct its strategy. And as I mentioned at the start of my remarks, I think these weapons have their best role in deterring the unlikely event of Chinese first use. But Australia's interests in this regard might differ a little bit from other allies, and I hope we can get into that in the discussion. And finally, I recommend in the paper that Australia use its existing alliance links to better understand US planning insofar as it pertains to things like inadvertent nuclear escalation, the kinds of contingencies the US is expecting Chinese nuclear use to occur in. And for the moment, though, I don't think that Australia needs a more explicit extended deterrence guarantee from the United States or a dialogue that is akin to what the South Koreans and Japan have with the United States that relates specifically to nuclear issues, but that might be something down the track if nuclear risks increase for reasons either relating to the US-Australia relationship or China's actions. I've touched on the point about Australia's literacy in deterrence and in matters regarding to China, so I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion.
That's great. Thank you so much, Fiona, for that overview of the paper. I might ask you one brief follow-up question, and then we'll bring in Euan and David to the discussion. You know, many of the changes to China's nuclear capabilities over the last several years, some of which you mentioned, SSBNs becoming a more regular feature, MERVed ICBMs and the DF-26, things like that, some of the modernization pieces. These programs were being put in motion a decade ago. You know, nuclear modernization takes place over that kind of time frame. So what do you think China's nuclear posture, to your kind of best analysis and guess, will look like a decade from now? And what do you think some of the obvious changes it would need to make and respond to some of the evolving strategic trends happening at the moment?
So speculating into the future is always a very difficult issue, and it's become a more difficult exercise when it comes to Chinese foreign policy in recent years because the changes have been perhaps more significant. There's more less continuity than there has been in the past. But my best guess is that what China is currently making decisions about with its nuclear posture are probably not decisions that we'll start to see evidence of for at least 10 years. And we won't start to see those systems come online probably or be fully mature for another 2 decades. So if you think out ahead to that sort of a time frame, what might China expect the world to look like? And I'm glad I'm not a Chinese nuclear planner because that sounds like a pretty tricky set of decisions. But some of the factors that I would point to that might be washing around within Chinese decision-making are as follows. One is what is going to happen with the future of the relationship with the United States, because I think that China's current military strategy is premised on this idea that it's coming out of a strategic opportunity period where its periphery and its environment was quite benign, and it's now gearing up for, I think, a much more competitive future. So that's one question. Will, for example, a future contingency with the United States turn into an unlimited war, or is the PLA going to keep on planning for local wars? A second question, I think China will be looking very carefully at what happens with US-Russia arms control, because if limits change on how many nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, the US and Russia are deploying, then this could change quite significantly the number of nuclear weapons that China is going to need to feel like its retaliatory capability alone could absorb a US first strike and be able to retaliate with enough nuclear weapons to deter the US from trying in the first place. So that's a second question. And I think the third question that China might be looking at going forward, it relates to the different kinds of missions that the People's Liberation Army might be looking at in the future. So I think up until recently, China has been very much focused on a Taiwan contingency and making sure that it would block Taiwan from declaring more independent status by increasing the costs of US intervention. And as the PLA becomes a more capable force, in particular with regards to that contingency, then nuclear weapons may have a different role to play. I would add, I think that last contingency is unlikely given other aspects that are important within China's nuclear strategy, in particular the importance of leadership control over when China uses nuclear weapons. But there are sort of three factors that if I were to stare into my crystal ball and guess is where I think things, the questions at least that Chinese leaders might be asking.
That's great. Thanks, Fiona. Euan's back. This might be a good point to jump in and bring Euan into the conversation. And I wanted to now kind of bring up one of the main things you talk about, Fiona, which is the chance of deliberate use of nuclear weapons in a future US-China conflict. So Euan, I want you to come in on this. Fiona argues that while both the risk of inadvertent and deliberate use of nuclear weapons are growing between the US and China, the chance of inadvertent use is higher, and we'll come to that just a little bit later. But one of the reasons that Fiona says is that the stakes of most US-China conflict scenarios wouldn't warrant deliberate use of nuclear weapons from either party, perhaps with Taiwan being an exception. What's your take on this? And do you see a Taiwan conflict as having significant potential risk of deliberate nuclear use from either side?
Thanks, Brendan, and congratulations to Fiona on an excellent paper, very timely and welcome, particularly in the Australian debate. I wholly endorse her call for a need for a more nuclear literate debate in Australia going forward. So I wanted to get that out first. In terms of the Taiwan scenario, well, look, I look at this as a non-specialist. I'm a generalist who looks across the broad spectrum of East Asian security. But it does occur to me that there's a forest and trees issue around looking at nuclear issues in isolation in China. I think the Taiwan scenario worries me because it is not something that may play out according to the rule book for local conflict, particularly if there's a military scenario and the PLA badly underperforms. China is going to find itself in a very different kind of crisis, a crisis that is strategic in the sense that it brings the United States, Taiwan, and China all into conflict, but it's also a political crisis in Beijing because it gets to the legitimacy will be on the line of the ruling party, of the PLA, and the leader of China, whether it's Xi Jinping or someone else in his shoes in future. So under those conditions, I think what is the objective that China seeks in Taiwan conflict scenario? It is primarily to force Taiwan into submission on its terms, and secondly, to deter the United States from intervening in that conflict in a way that would tip the balance. So that itself, I think, suggests there will be a powerful escalatory logic if the conventional arm of the PLA underperforms. And that, I don't think that would go as far as use of nuclear weapons against a civilian population in Taiwan. I think that's too far a stretch. But there are many things that China could do in that crisis situation. For example, to issue a nuclear ultimatum to compel Taiwan and the authorities there quickly to terms. I think that's certainly, it's an extreme scenario, but it's not an impossible scenario. And under those conditions, doctrine goes out the window. It becomes really a political call, and one that will have to be made, as we've seen with the casebook in previous crisis conditions, in the realm not just of nuclear doctrine, but human psychology as well, under very stressful conditions. And I think that's one potential that does worry me, because I think that that point, past will not be a predictor of the future.
That's great. Thanks, Euan. Fiona, do you want to respond, or you have any comments?
Look, I think what Euan is spelling out is a really powerful logic with regards to, you know, how things don't always go the way that countries plan to when they're making, you know, even their worst case scenario plans about using things like nuclear weapons. But I would just add that for China to do something like issuing an ultimatum would require a judgment on the part of the Chinese leadership that they're likely to make a successful bluff. And I am not sure that, you know, again, the rule book sort of goes out the window when you're in some of these situations, but I'm not entirely sure that Chinese leaders would be as confident that they would get away with that kind of a bluff. And so they might be put in a situation of actually having to make good on those threats. So I think that's the kind of key question there is, you know, if you're called upon to do it, are you going to go ahead and do it, or are you going to suffer the reputational consequences of stepping back from that brink? And so I think for that reason, Chinese leaders would be very careful about running that kind of a scenario, and have tried to create as many other options as they can than going down the road of nuclear threats in that situation.
Thanks, Fiona. David, I might bring you in. Oh, go ahead, Euan. Yeah.
Just a very brief point back to Fiona's counter to that. I think the fact that the center of gravity of a Taiwan conflict will not necessarily be US-China, I think that's often assumed, but really the key variable here is the willingness and ability of Taiwan to hold out, and Taiwan is a non-nuclear power. So I think in response to the argument that Chinese analysts feel they cannot generally control nuclear escalation, one possible exception to that, again, is the Taiwan scenario, for the obvious reason that Taiwan itself does not have a nuclear capability, and therefore will be outmatched in that escalation, all bets off wildcard scenario. So in terms of use of following through on the credibility, I also accept that it would not be credible for China to threaten you know, nuclear annihilation on involving civilian populations in Taiwan. But there are other things that could be done. Taiwan does have outlying territory, or remote nuclear assets could be, in theory, targeted. Or we might see a demonstration of nuclear capability in the Taiwan Strait, or even within China itself. I think that would put extraordinary pressure on Taipei's leaders under crisis conditions to respond.
That's a good opportunity to bring David in. And, you know, I think we have to remind ourselves that obviously US-China nuclear dynamics do not occur in a vacuum. It's a kind of a multipolar situation. So, David, I want to bring you in here a little bit on terms of placing these in the deliberate use, because I want to come to the inadvertent use, because I think the entanglement dynamics are really interesting. But just in the general sense, can you give us some context around how the US-China nuclear relationship is being managed, and what are the kind of multipolar dynamics surrounding it as well? And I think this is particularly relevant for the United States, because we always have to remind ourselves the United States is managing probably the most, well, it is managing the most nuclear deterrence relationships in the world, globally, not only extended nuclear deterrence, but also multiple nuclear adversaries or other dynamics as well. So I don't know if you can give us some context around that.
Yes, absolutely. First of all, thank you, Brandon, and the US Study Centers for organizing this. Thank you for your paper, Fiona, which I encourage everybody to read. I thought it was excellent. In terms of you know, the US-China nuclear relationship, as Fiona mentioned, this is still, to Beijing, it's really the United States that still motivates what China is doing. So it's pretty much the focus. Over the years, of course, China has grown increasingly wary or interested in India in particular. North Korea is also a power that it has to contend with, and the Russia factor has obviously, you know, grown in importance. Even though China has been looking at the United States in structuring its military policy and posture and nuclear policy and posture, it's been looking around as well increasingly. And so the multipolar context matters increasingly. That being said, Beijing's focus remains the United States. And you know, I can tell you, for instance, that for about 15 years, the United States has run a track 1.5 dialogue with the Chinese to try and understand how, not only how China views nuclear weapons, understands nuclear weapons, and as a way to try and establish a workable nuclear relationship with the Chinese. And this is actually a track 1.5 that my organization, the Pacific Forum, has run in partnership with the Naval Postgraduate School and a couple of Chinese think tanks, including one affiliated with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And over the course of these 15 years, we've learned a lot about how China approaches nuclear weapons and how the focus started by being exclusively on the United States, and how increasingly over the years, China has looked at these other actors, India, Russia, and so on and so forth. You know, from a US perspective, the United States still has for years wanted to open up an official strategic dialogue with China, with the eventual goal to get to an arms control relationship. And you know, I'd have a lot to say about this, but from a Chinese perspective, the primary sticking point has been the fact that the United States has refused to publicly acknowledge that there is a relationship of mutual vulnerability with China. Basically, that there is a nuclear deterrence relationship, one in which the United States would not dominate. And so for a long time during the Obama administration, the approach was basically let's have a wait and see approach to engaging the Chinese. Let's wait until the Chinese are ready to engage and eventually move to arms control. And this was also, for that matter, the approach adopted by the Bush administration and before that by the Clinton administration. That approach clearly hasn't worked. The Chinese have not been willing to engage in dialogue. So patience in some ways hasn't worked. The approach that the Trump administration has adopted since 2017 has been, you know, focusing on pressure, really. That also hasn't worked. And from my perspective, if we are going to get into a situation in which we engage the Chinese in dialogue and eventually develop an arms control relationship, then we will have to balance pressure with a number of incentives. And we will have to look at the multipolar context, because again, that relationship works, you know, but a number of actors are also involved. And so I like Fiona's point in her paper in the need to involve maybe the P5 process and a number of other actors to try and make that happen.
That's great. Thanks, David. And just a reminder to our listeners and viewers that you can submit Q&A questions in the chat, because we'll come to those in a few minutes. I want to bring it back to the allies a little bit, right? And I think this is the kind of central point for Australia, particularly. Australia, and as Fiona argues in her paper, has an overriding interest in making sure that there's, and I think the Taiwan scenario, by the way, kind of emphasizes this, that there's we have an overriding interest in a US, but really a collective approach to deterrence in the region that's based on conventional forces rather than relying outsized on nuclear risk. And as Fiona rightly says, nuclear risk is going to be part of this equation, but we have to figure out what the balance is in terms of balancing the interests on deterring Chinese adventurism and within the region, but also not necessarily raising the risks of nuclear escalation, particularly perhaps with theater-based weapons and these types of things too far. And Australia plays a role in this. You know, I don't know if Euan, maybe you want to comment first, and then to David, how does a country like Australia balance those things? And perhaps we can also get an insight bit on how South Korea and Japan also view those issues.
I think in historical scope, extended deterrence has not really been front and center of the US-Australia alliance dynamic or debate. It's been there almost as an afterthought, certainly in comparison with Japan and South Korea, where nuclear threats are felt far more proximately, not only from China, but also from North Korea, especially with the advances that it's made in recent years. So I think the alliances themselves are very different in structure when you actually pick them apart. I'm talking about the Pacific alliances of the United States. So that also reflects their variability in the nuclear dimension as well. South Korea is almost wholly focused on the threat from the north. China is there really as a kind of indirect shadow. It's not absent, but it's certainly not the crux of the nuclear dimension of the alliance. For Japan, I think it is much more front and center that they feel themselves facing not necessarily nuclear threats from China, but ultimately they have the same problem that all non-nuclear powers have when dealing with nuclear powers that are using coercive levers. Even if they're below a certain threshold, there's no obvious way to control or counter that nuclear escalation threat, except to bring indirect dependence on a third party, which has been the United States. That's worked well up until now, but I think, again, a general point about extended nuclear deterrence, it tends to be more effective with smaller numbers of players and lower levels of threat. I think the more acute it becomes, and the more that proliferation it increases the complexity of the threat, then I think nuclear deterrence really starts to come under challenge. Australia is feeling those pressures much less directly still, but we have seen deterrence enter the Australian strategic debate with a new defence update that was released in July. Now, there's a very cursory mention of nuclear dynamics within that, but I think the point for our viewers to stress in general terms is there is no firewall between conventional conflict and nuclear conflict. It's an artificial line. And although China has not gone down the road that Russia has, Fiona makes a very good point of the Russian model of escalating to de-escalate. We don't see evidence of that. But I think inherently, the conventional and nuclear thresholds are going to get blurred, particularly as China's conventional capabilities continue to grow and locally challenge those of the United States. I think it's inevitable that the United States is going to have to fall back increasingly on nuclear weapons to maintain the balance.
Yeah, and I think you already may see that blurring on the American side between conventional and nuclear domains. Fiona or David, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I agree with everything Euan said. I think that what we've been seeing over the past decade or so is growing willingness on the part of Asian allies to participate actively in deterrence, in extended deterrence. And I say extended deterrence, not extended nuclear deterrence, because I think ultimately it's more than just about nuclear weapons. And so in 2010, we created the US-Japan bilateral extended deterrence dialogue and the US-South Korea extended deterrence dialogues to get basically a greater sense of enfranchisement for Tokyo and Seoul, getting them a little bit more involved in not only the decision-making process, but also in capability developments, so that they actually participate, they do deterrence more so than benefit from the so-called U.S. nuclear umbrella, security umbrella. And I think what we've seen over the past, I want to say 2-3 years in the Australia context is a growing interest in getting involved in these issues. And that's also why your Center and Pacific Forum have established the Track 1.5 US-Australia Indo-Pacific Deterrence Dialogue, which is meant to try and build support for for more debate about deterrence issues, and also build knowledge and capacity on these issues. And from an Australia perspective, the other point I'll make is that there's also, I think, great promise to not only build deterrence within the context of the alliance, but also to try and get regional countries familiar with deterrence and try and see how we can integrate the deterrence question into the broader security architecture, especially at a time when China is rising and causing, or at least raising, a number of questions for regional actors.
Fiona, I might give you the last word before we move to Q&A. Do you want to have any final comments on that? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I'm just going to make one really quick note, which is David's mentioned that I suggested working the US-China relationship more into the P5 is very much me borrowing from the great ideas of other colleagues who work on some of these questions from, in particular, a deep knowledge of arms control in the European context. In this case, my footnote goes straight to Steve Pfeiffer. But I think we have some great opportunities actually in thinking about arms control being more than just China and the United States, to borrow and have cross-fertilization across the European and East Asian communities in thinking about some of these questions. So that's, I think, an opportunity we can look forward to. I would just note really quickly two things. With regards to Australia versus the South Korea and Japan, I think my co-panelists have also already made the point very well that these three countries all face quite different conflict scenarios that involve nuclear weapons, and they play different roles in terms of their direct exposure to nuclear threats. And Australia's, I would argue, are more indirect. But there's also interesting differences in terms of the nuclear latency of these countries, that Japan and South Korea obviously have quite significant civilian nuclear programs as well, and are discussed in those terms. They're also in range already of some of China's medium range and intermediate range nuclear tipped ballistic missiles in ways that Australia isn't. So there's some important differences in the considerations I think the countries face, and it behooves the three countries to talk a little bit more about them to make sure that they are not working at cross purposes, if you like, for building up a robust deterrence architecture based on whatever right balance there is between nuclear and conventional. The final point, though, I just wanted to make is that is to touch on and really emphasize Brendan's point about and Euan's point as well, about the lack of bright lines between conventional and nuclear conflict. Information networks are now supporting both conventional and military operations. Certainly, I think within the United States, we have the addition of missile defense, which can defend against conventional as well as nuclear missiles, as well as against North Korea versus, as Chinese experts will argue, against their nuclear capabilities. And also similar delivery systems being used in China's case for both conventional as well as nuclear payloads. So all of these sorts of new technological developments, as well as ways of operating nuclear and conventional forces, are creating that sort of blurred line where it becomes difficult, I think, for adversaries to know what's coming at them and what they might be striking. And that's, I think, a real challenge in managing escalation in East Asia in the future.
Hey, Brendan, can I come in?
Go ahead, David, just briefly, yeah, because we want to go to Q&A. Yep. Go ahead, David.
I'm sorry, you broke up. I didn't hear you.
Yep, go ahead, David.
Thank you. Just an additional point based on what Fiona has just said. I think, to build up on what you said, what that means is when we're thinking about arms control in a US-China context, we need to think about two things. Number one, I think we can't have a strict nuclear arms control, nuclear dialogue. It's got to be a broad dialogue that encompasses a number of technologies, because the strategic relationship is such, it's so complicated that we need to actually look or have a broad approach to these issues. That's number one. And number two, I think when we look at arms control, we have to think about crisis avoidance and crisis management first. To me, this is part of arms control. There's a tendency, of course, in recent years to look at arms control as essentially treaties meant to reduce arsenals and proceed in nuclear reductions. I actually view arms control in a much broader sense, and I think we need to incorporate crisis management and crisis avoidance. This is really the priority at least in the US-China context. And it also means that allies have a role to play, because they can participate in such mechanisms.
Thanks very much, David. Listen, we got about 10, 12 minutes left for a few questions, so I'll just go to one now. So we've got some pre-submitted questions, one from Marianne Hansen, who's a professor at the University of Queensland. She asks, given that China has an explicit no first use policy, will a Biden presidency consider the US adopting a no first use policy also? I wonder if, David, maybe you just have a quick answer to this, and Fiona, if you have any insights. There's obviously a long debate over the last, 8 years in the United States during the Obama administration. So I'm just interested about what your take on that is, David or Fiona. Maybe David first.
Sure. Well, I mean, clearly China has had a no first use policy since 1964. It's important to note as well that there has been debates in China about maintaining or not that policy. But I'll just say this about China's NFU policy. As Fiona mentioned, first of all, it's only a declaratory policy. It has the value of a declaratory policy. It's unclear whether it would hold in a crisis. And number two, the Chinese modernization process has been raising a number of questions as to whether that policy can be maintained in the future. So there's a number of questions as to whether it's explicit or it's real, or it will survive over the long term, even though I will admit that it seems to be deeply ingrained in the Chinese psyche. As to whether a Biden administration would adopt an NFU policy, I'm sure a number of people will push for it. I think a lot will depend on who gets the top jobs. It seems to me that there are a number of different perspectives about, recommending an NFU policy. And to me, an important point is that many US presidents in the past have considered adopting an NFU, and all have assessed that this isn't in US interests. And given the current environment, I don't think that this is the right time for this. It doesn't seem that a Biden administration would go that route, but I could be wrong.
Thanks, David. I don't know if Fiona, or you have anything major to say on that?
All I would just say is in 27, on the record, Joe Biden, when vice president, made some pretty clear remarks suggesting that there weren't any instances in which the administration believed that it would be necessary to be using nuclear weapons first. But that said, one of the other proposals that I think is floating around is a sole purpose declaration, which is not a no first use policy, but the idea that nuclear weapons are only used to deter, or rather are used in that nuclear context. And I would just note that the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Hyten, gave public comments at a symposium a couple of weeks ago in which he made it fairly clear that he thought this would be unnecessarily tying the president's hands. So that can give you a sense of the parameters of that debate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So Euan, I might come to you on this next one, and feel free to it's a bit out, maybe it's a bit outside our collective experience, but maybe some general thoughts. So Daniel Steedman asks, how much does the panel see the ongoing Sino-Indian strategic rivalry acting as a complicating push-pull mechanism on the U.S.-China nuclear relationship? So how much is the sort of ongoing tensions between India and China impacting, do you think, China's broader security concerns?
I'd be interested in what David has to say on this too, but I think so far, although we've seen a much more escalatory conventional dynamic across the land frontier between India and China, that hasn't bled into the nuclear dimension as much as it could have. In fact, I think we've seen less evidence of nuclear signaling by both parties than was the case in the less serious Doklam crisis a few years ago. But nonetheless, I think the broader threat perception is growing in India that China is going to use coercive tactics, including challenging India in direct territorial terms across the frontier. So that gets to a very core existential security question for India. And it will no doubt eventually have some impact on India's nuclear force posture. We've seen, I think, the general embrace of the United States by India is going to increase. We've just had a quadrilateral meeting take place in Tokyo where the Indian foreign minister gave really quite forward comments, not in a nuclear dimension, but clearly the urge to work more closely with US and its allies in a kind of proto-coalition. That's where I really see the influence rather than in the direct nuclear relationship.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Euan, that there hasn't been as much nuclear rumors, as one way to put it, as was during the Doklam standoff in 2017, where there was some really worrying reports coming out about mobilization and other sorts of things in the Indian media. So that is a good thing. David, we just have a few minutes. Do you want to, and I want to fit one more question in, do you have any quick points on this one?
No, I would agree with what Euan said. Basically, I haven't seen any nuclear signaling. I think it's possible that it will change the dynamic, but this is the kind of thing that we'll have to see over the long term. But I was worried about it initially. It doesn't seem to have had any nuclear, anything significant in the nuclear dimension.
Great. We'll do one last question here from our friend Ashley Townshend. So Fiona writes, the United States has recently deployed low-yield warheads on submarines that could carry out limited nuclear strikes in East Asia. So do you, Euan and David, agree with Fiona's judgment that this is a destabilizing move? So this is the Trump administration's push to put low-yield warheads on, and I think, Fiona, you're talking about the ICBMs here on US submarines. I know that there's also a sea-based cruise missile sort of longer in the works, but they've done an immediate upgrade on their low-yield ICBMs on submarines. So David, Euan, I'm not sure if you guys have any, but do you think this is a destabilizing move? There was a lot of debate about this at the time.
So no one's going first. So
yeah, you go, David.
Look, is that causing trouble to strategic deterrence? I would tend to think it doesn't. I think it could strengthen deterrence, but I also see a potential for escalatory steps in a number of scenarios. So I don't think you can have a clear-cut view on this. It can certainly strengthen deterrence, but these weapons are really meant to address the Russia problem more so than anything that we see in East Asia. So this is how I look at it, I guess.
Euan, do you have any comments on that? Any thoughts?
Well, only to say that it's another evidence point that we're moving back to the future, because I mean this was the case during the Cold War, that the United States had nuclear weapons deployed across its surface fleet, And I think that we are seeing some repeated dynamics, albeit through a more complicated threat lens in which we have multiple players and China, not least the focus of US naval attention. So the basic underlying instability question is, I think the more players you have, the more complex the dynamics. That holds.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that puts us right on time. So I might wrap us up. So I'd really like to thank our panelists today, Fiona, David, and Euan. It has been, I think, a really excellent discussion. I'd like to remind our listeners that today's session and past events are all available on the USSC website to listen to, and also to be sure to tune in for our next webinar, which is this Friday on the 9th of October. It will be a debriefing of the vice presidential debate, which I think is tomorrow. So thanks to everyone again, and thanks for our panelists. It's been a great discussion, and thanks, Fiona, for your paper. It's been fantastic. Thanks very much.
Take care. Well, thanks so much, Brendan. That was a great discussion.